Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 316 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. On today's episode, I finally was able to speak with one of the most inspiring Canadian photographers of our time, Richard Martin. Richard is a creative powerhouse, and I just love his approach to making images. Our conversation covers a huge plethora of topics revolving around his creative approaches for making images, and there's a lot of actionable advice in today's episode, so I highly encourage you to listen all the way to the end. Before we dive in, I want to thank our newest Patreon supporter, Kirsten Gregg. Kirsten opted to support us to gain access to episodes early, which keeps me highly motivated to produce episodes up to a month or more in advance for our Patreon supporters. Thank you, Kirsten. You rock. If you would like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/fstop and listen. And you can also find a link in the show notes. Thanks in advance for your amazing help in keeping the show afloat. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Richard Martin. All right, Richard Martin, it is so awesome to finally get you on the podcast.
Well, it's so good to be here, and I'm really delighted you invited me out for this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, of course. I can't even count on two hands how many people have recommended you for the show, and I know Eric Bennett really wanted you to come on the show, so finally we've pulled it off.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah.
It's great to be here.
And by the way, we both did Out of Chicago Live not too long ago, and you were the keynote speaker, and you absolutely crushed it.
Well, it's good to hear that. Thank you. I was pretty nervous for that. That was a live event, and there was a lot of hype leading up to the beginning. Yeah, so plus I was my first time doing a keynote, and I was wondering, can I do this? So I'm glad it worked.
Yeah, well, you did. I mean, it was amazing. I mean, I've heard so many people say good things about it. So
that's great.
Yeah. So for people that aren't familiar with you and your photography, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, I'm Richard Martin, and I'm from Canada. I live in Kingston, a small city on Lake Ontario. Actually, it's on the borderline of U.S., Canada, where the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario meets the St. Lawrence River. So it's situated between two major cities, Montreal and Toronto. So it's a nice place to live, and you can always access the bigger places as you want to. And it's just a really good central place. But anywhere you live is good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. I don't know. I could think of some places I wouldn't want to live, but...
The grass is always greener on the other side, right?
Oh, there's that. Yeah, for sure. And you're now a full-time photographer, is that right?
Yeah, I am full-time. I primarily do workshops and photo tours, so that's how I earn my income from that. So I kind of have all my eggs in one basket, so to speak, and I felt that during COVID, because what was gone from COVID was travel, and that was my business. So I'm slowly getting back, but it's okay. I love it. Enjoy it.
That really hurt a lot of people, for sure, and I think it taught some people some lessons too in terms of diversification.
Yeah, the fallout was big, and there was also some big winners too, if you're in real estate and stuff. But you always manage to, as humans, we always manage to sort of work around it.
And are you married, kids, any of that stuff?
I have two daughters and a partner. I'm so that's where I stand now.
Okay, good deal. And your daughters?
My daughter, one is a graphic designer, and the other one has a PhD in nutrition. So she's a nutritionist at one of the hospitals, and the other one's a graphic designer. So I have a graphic designer in the family, which is nice.
Yeah, does she give you critique on your photography?
Not so much on the photography, but we're always discussing fonts and design. I love graphic design too. I'm kind of a wannabe graphic designer, so I enjoy that.
Nice, I love it.
Yeah, so it's
well,
nice.
Well, I know from our correspondence that you grew up in the Thousand Islands region near Lake Ontario. Can you tell us a little bit about how growing up there informed your love for nature and the eventual pursuit of photography?
Yeah, well, I was always surrounded by the natural world, and as a child, I was very interested in nature and always exploring and spending a lot of time in forests. And I'm a big fan of trees. And sounds kind of weird, but yeah. So that was, those formative years were pretty solid. And even though at the same time I was drawing and sketching and stuff like that, so I had this really strong interest in the visual arts as well. So that was also a very early part of my, growth, or a foundation, I could say, in my photography. Later on to be photography. I didn't, and I grew up in times when there wasn't iPhones, there wasn't accessible cameras like there is today. Everybody has a camera in their hand. So that was different. But the flip side or positive side of that is I wasn't distracted by gaming game machines and so on, and so I was outdoors all the time. Whereas I think it's a different today. It's not better or worse, but there's more distractions from getting outside and just exploring and doing things as a child. So more competition now. But yeah, so those formative years are good in terms of where it's landed me now in terms of what I'm doing with the camera.
Yeah, my son is 15 and spends a lot of time on his phone. And sometimes I wonder what that's going to do in terms of his interest in the natural world or relationships with other people. We've never gone through anything like this before as a species, so it's like all new territory.
Yeah, it's easy for us to preach to the different generation what they should be doing, but I'm sure if we were in their place, we'd probably do the same. It's all in the context of...
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I was a kid, I probably split my time between being outside and playing Nintendo, so...
That's cool. You're much younger than me.
Well, and then you said you spent a lot of time doing graphic design type stuff, and I'm curious, how did those skills translate into shaping your approach to making images?
Well, that was when I was mentioning that today with my daughter being a graphic designer, I've always been interested in graphic design. It's kind of an interesting connection there. But going back to, early adulthood, where I went through college to be an architectural technologist, and I worked 16 years in a firm and as an architectural technologist. So that was really interesting years. And that was, I did photography for the architects and for projects, but it was utilitarian in its approach. So back in, I just wrote, I'm not very good at dates, but in 76, at the beginning of my career in architecture, I discovered, I'd always go at lunch break to this beautiful bookstore and look at the art books and so on. And I discovered the work of Ernest Haas. That was in 1976. So it's a long time ago. And it just blew me away what you could do with a camera. And suddenly I realized that this was something I wanted to, kind of change everything. And I think I can not just be utilitarian with the camera, I can actually be childlike and live like a childlike, fantasies with finding stuff with the camera. Being adult with a camera is a license to be childlike without, getting away with it. But it's interesting too, at the same time, that same year I discovered that book, The Creation, which had in the back of the book, it had all different ways he did double exposure and so on. And I had a Leica R3 camera, and it had the multiple exposure function on it. So right from my very first few months of ever owning a camera, I had the functions of doing double exposures or multiple exposures and experimenting, and I love coming from the visual arts side of it. I was trying to adapt using the camera as a medium to express feelings and ideas. And I just dove into that and never looked back. But at the same year, a double whammy, the same year I discovered that book. Freeman Patterson, another famous Canadian photographer, was coming through to Queen's University in my city, and he had a seminar, and I went to that, and that turned everything around. So those two icons of photography have really formed the beginning foundation of how I think about using the camera. And of course, from there on, there's all kinds of other influences, but I enjoy it as much now as I have since I started, which is 40 plus years. And in the first 21 years of using a camera, I didn't include people in the picture, which was interesting.
That is
observation. It wasn't intentional. It was just an observation that, probably because I was, maybe not as interested, or maybe I was so fixated on, having, nature or natural subjects without the influence. But I slowly, progressed, and I started working. When I did a workshop in Cuba, I started working with a photojournalist. He kind of, got me into photographing with people as an element in the picture. He told me I contaminated him with my art, because he said, and he said, this is a little bit insulting maybe, but he looks at my artsy pictures and he said, your images look like empty movie sets. And he said, all photographs must have a person in them. Well, I thought that was a little ridiculous, but we still joked around, of course. It wasn't like meanness, but it was more of a teasing thing, I suppose. But it did make me think.
Yeah. Anytime
someone says something to you, it makes you think, right? It kind of gets into your head and think, wow.
So going back to the architecture angle, as you were talking, I realized that in architecture, for the most part, you're kind of confined by the boundaries of reality in terms of like engineering and physics and and material strength and things like that. You can't just imagine anything. Like, it has to be within certain parameters. And I'm curious if the photography was almost like an escape for you away from some of those rigid constraints that architecture kind of forces you to be a part of.
That's a good point, and very true. I was 16 years in the firm, and it was a very creative environment, but there's a lot of limitations. Not every architect gets to be like Frank Gehry. There's all kinds of practical restraints, right? And budgets and so on.
Right, cost.
Yeah. But the pressure of that whole office thing, and I'm not a really, when I look back, I'm not really a fan of working in an office. So it was a good escape or a good segue because I started teaching workshops and starting doing some, speaking engagements before I left the firm, but it was a slow transition, and you go from, an income that is somewhat guaranteed to one that's, different than that. Right? If you're self-employed, it's very different. Not for everyone, I suppose. But the benefits pay off. I think there's a lot of advantages. I mean, you can look at the plus and minuses, but I wouldn't change a thing if I could do it over. I prefer to have a good quality of life than to be super, super rich. Although both would be nice, but
or tied to a desk.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't like. So that's got us some value right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at what point did your photography evolve into a tool for personal expression?
The moment that, when I mentioned before, the moment that I discovered the work of those two icons, that was a moment that said, okay, this is not just utilitarian. This is it could be so much more exciting. And I didn't really realize that because, I just wasn't exposed to that. So it was good timing and good, just the way serendipity worked. But yeah.
So in using photography as a medium for self-expression, is that something that you are doing intentionally in the moment, or is it something that you become more aware of after the fact, or kind of what's that process look like for you?
Yeah, that's a good point. I never have an agenda. I've never had a plan with my photography. It's natural. So it's something I realized later after looking at my work that it was deeply personal because I was doing it for myself. I wasn't doing it for someone else. So, it's very much a personal thing. So all my photography that people see online and so on, and whatever way they get to see it in magazines, it's all deeply personal and expressive. It's like, interpreting dreams. You can interpret photographs, and you can learn a lot about somebody by studying their work. It's interesting.
That is true.
Yeah.
It's funny we brought this up because I was in a debate just today with some other photographers about this on Discord, and I keep coming back to this concept of intent when it comes to creating. And I know that intent isn't a necessary ingredient for creative process, but I'm curious for you, does intent play any role in terms of kind of how you approach making images and what the final result is?
Yeah. I really go out. I mean, I've evolved over the years, but at this moment and many years before this, I usually go out without really any intent. I just, I've learned that I just want to go out with my camera, and I don't worry about, I just want to go out, and if I have a certain time I can go, I'll just go anyway, regardless of the wind blowing or whatever happens, and I'll just be out there with my camera. And I'll find interesting things, and I may not find any things that I was maybe looking for. Although I have long learned long ago that if you have unrealistic expectations, then you're going to be disappointed a lot. So, like for example, frost on grasses, and you could go out for 5 mornings and there's no frost, and then the morning you don't go out, there is.
Right.
So, I learned that just to relax and let go and just enjoy it, really. So I guess I don't have an intent. Sounds kind of weird, but and I enjoy it so much, just going out and it actually improves my photography. It sounds a little bit different because most people have very strict goals, right? About what.
Yeah, no, I mean it doesn't sound weird to me. I mean, I also don't really have intent usually when I'm out. Mm-hmm. It sounds like, I mean, I used to, but it sounds like you and me are more like, if we were to say hunter and gatherer, like it sounds like you're more of a gatherer than a hunter. Yeah,
definitely. I've always considered myself a gatherer in an approach to photography. So it's a very relaxed approach with no set goals, and I just wish I'd known this years ago. This approach, or I wasn't really aware of it. I mean, it's not like if you're a hunter or a gatherer by approach to photography, most people think that's a competition, but it's not like one is better or worse than the other. It's like a test to see what kind of personality you are. You just are that way, right? So it's not like better or worse. And I hear people getting into this competition about, I'm a hunter, I'm a gatherer, and so on. But when you think of all the words used in photography, it does sound like the hunter, right? You shoot something, you point and shoot, you capture it. These are all like kind of aggressive terms, I think. But it's interesting. It's almost like a comedian would look at something like that, those words, because we just use them without really. It's just the language we use, right? Anyways,
what are your alternative words?
I don't have any. I use the same ones, I suppose. I just get caught up in Sometimes you find yourself conscious of, I just said I'm going to go. Yeah, you don't tell the customs guy you're going to go shooting something on the street, stuff like that. So I prefer when I'm out. I prefer to let things unfold, and I like to be open and unbiased, non-judgmental. And it depends on your personality, and it depends on what you're photographing, because. If I was photographing wildlife and stuff like that, I would have to have a different approach. So I'm not saying that. It's just that, the work that I make and what I enjoy doing, it's just, that's kind of where I fit into that sort of hunter-gatherer kind of thing. And it's always been, like, the process for me has always been one of discovery. So I like that whole thing. to, natural impulses over reason, and, I'm never worried about being logical or in my approach to that.
But it sounds like it wasn't always that way for you?
Well, I suppose at the beginning, but it was because of the, your background, right? Your experience. So in architecture, it's a different thing. So it took a little while for that kind of to maybe evaporate. And as I find, this artistic expression with the camera, with the medium of photography. I mean, you can use these are all just terms, and you can use all kinds of words to describe this stuff, and it can be very art speak, but ultimately it's personal. So I'm lucky that I'm able to just do what I want to do, because I use my images for teaching. I use them to inspire students in my workshops. And I did a lot of articles over the years with Photo Life magazine. I was 16 years writing for that magazine, and mostly articles about creativity and design, and really no articles on how to. But there's lots of those out there. But I just wanted to do something I wanted to contribute something that they weren't covering so much, which was really needed to be covered. And
more of that is still needed, I think.
It is. So there can never be enough of that. There's a lot of talk about, there's nothing wrong with talking about equipment, and obviously you need to know the tools. But I don't, like some people I know, I don't swim in the technology and do the backstroke in it sort of thing. I only want to know as much as I can know. I don't want to know anymore. But I slowly learn things I need to learn, but I use my camera in a very basic way, in a very, straightforward.
I would say that's probably one of my biggest regrets in my photography career is I spent far too much time obsessing about equipment and numbers and stats and megapixels, and it's also sexy and exciting, but it doesn't really make you a better photographer.
Definitely not. Without question not, no. But it's useful. I mean, we have access to all this equipment, and we have choices. And why not make choices? And, I often rely on my friends who are really, really knowledgeable about equipment. If every so often, if I go to get a new camera, I might ask around about that. Because I don't really have the interest in researching myself. And I have some people I put my trust in. But, so, that's about it on that part of it. But yeah, equipment thing can be, let's face it, there's a lot of hype around equipment, and you need to, of course, when you're selling equipment, everything is hype, right? So
enough about equipment. No one's excited about equipment. So, Richard, I see you as one of the more creative photographers of our time, and I'm curious, what have been some of the keys for your creative development?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a very good compliment too. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The key for me is, I know we talked about this a bit. So first and foremost, I make pictures for the joy of it, and without thinking about practicality and serving a purpose. So, it's like, I'm not really, because I'm doing that without serving any purpose or practicality, and it's a very, very personal and joyful experience. I'm free to just be very, very creative, because I'm not restrained by, restrictions, and I'm not having to conform to some group or individual. So I'm free to be myself, and it's like, I don't really care if people like or don't like my images. Obviously, you want people to like your work, but what happens when you try and please everybody and impress everybody with your work? You lose your individuality. It's kind of like going to school back in the day, and you want to fit into a group, so you dress differently, you maybe talk differently, or your attitude is different, but it's not really yourself. But you're trying to get in that group, or trying to, be accepted. So, same thing with creativity and photography, I suppose. If you can let go of all that, you can be totally free to keep growing in your photography. And you obviously need some passion and interest in it as well. But I see that a lot. The biggest hindrance in people, making breakthroughs in their creativity is, one is also, it's not only that, it's also the fact that they don't believe they're creative because maybe someone told them they weren't, or they're not confident enough. So some of those things are restricting them. So I think that's how I keep growing creatively, and I'm still growing. I mean, as old as I am, and after 40 plus years, I am as passionate about photography as I was when I began, maybe even more so. And there's never been better times than right now to make images the way you want them to be presented, because we have so many great tools to use, but the tools won't make us better, or I should say better and creative. They're just tools to that. We are the creative, our imaginations and our minds are that way. So going back to that previous thing about, it's kind of boring talking about equipment, but that's all been talked about before. But so, I'm always striving for personal growth and new direction, and trying new things, and kind of self-evaluating what I do, and finding patterns that I may want to get out of, that I get stuck in, and I may try something different. And it's a real evolution process. How about you? Is that something that I noticed your photography change over, because I started, I think during COVID is when I sort of got more into social media and stuff, but I did see a big change in your work too. I mean, we're all evolving in our creative sense. And do you feel that yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, I think the biggest change has been just being more open to what I find versus having a set agenda. That's really helped me a lot in terms of just reacting to what I find in the field, and just responding to it, being the person that I am. Like, certain things excite me that might not excite you, and vice versa. And I think that's what differentiates us as creative people. Is, you might be super interested in water and reflections in water and movement in water, and I might find that sort of interesting, but I might find something else more interesting. So it's really just about honing in on kind of what excites you, and then trying to harness that energy and developing it into something that has some cohesion, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like it's like movies, watching movies and different interests, or listening to music, or all that kind of thing. I mean, it'd be very boring if we were all the same and we all like the same thing.
Yes.
Do you find in your photography, you sometimes have preconceived ideas about? I mean, it depends on the subject matter, but do you find that gets in your way if you go out on a hike and you kind of know what you might expect, or that question kind of leads me into like where I wanted to take this conversation next, because one thing that I do notice about myself on occasion is that I look at a lot of photography because I run the Natural Landscape Photography Awards, and I have a podcast, so I look at a lot of people's work constantly, and it's in my head, and I see a lot of stuff, and sometimes I have noticed that I might be photographing a subject, maybe like aspen leaves or something, and I remember a certain photographer's presentation of that, and it's like I get a little bit kind of obsessive compulsive about wanting to create the photo in that image versus trying to play with it in my own style. So that's something that I've noticed about myself that I have to be conscious of, not to try to, copy other people necessarily, and try to be more just reactive. Yeah. So that's about, are you talking about in terms of, comparing your work, or,
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be one of my next...
It's human nature to do that, but
it
can't be.
So that, for me, it's not necessarily about comparison when I'm in the field. It's more like, I remember so-and-so created an image of that subject, and I liked what they did with it. Maybe I could play with that idea too. And then you end up creating something that looks very similar to that person's image, but might not necessarily be you.
Right, yeah. So subconsciously, sometimes we're influenced. I know that music is that way. There's a lot of bands that, how many times have, and it's been court cases, and how many times have I listened to music and say, that sounds just like another band. But
right.
These may be coincidental, but, it does sometimes unconsciously creep in.
Right.
But I think...
Well, for me, it's very conscious. Like, I'm very aware when it happens.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's different.
Yeah, like, here's a perfect example. Last fall, I think it was my second day of my trip, it snowed. And that's pretty unusual for Colorado fall. Like, when it snows, it's really exciting and really special. And it was also windy, so that meant in my mind, I knew, there's a fresh blanket of snow. There's going to be aspen leaves on top of the snow. That's going to make for some really interesting contrast. And I remember just setting off on my own and hiking in the woods, and I found this really large area of just snow with leaves on it, and all I could see was this specific photo of Eric Bennett's in my head that I've always admired. And it's like, and that's all I could see is like, I want to recreate a similar image like his. So that's an example of what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I understand that. Yeah, it can creep in there, but I think one thing I've noticed in social media for me is I get a lot of feedback saying that I knew this was your image. They're talking about to me. They knew it was my image before they looked at the name. And I've heard that many, many years on Facebook and even more recently on like Instagram comments. And I think that's a nice thing to hear because I don't even we don't look at our own work like other people do, and we're too close to it. And
right.
It's very hard for us to see patterns in our own work for the most part. We can see some obvious ones, but so that is nice to hear. But I mean, there are times when things are similar and situations are similar, but I think Eric's got into your head. That's what he's done.
He did. So the unfortunate thing is that I used to get people used to say the same thing to me back in like 2014, but it wasn't for good reasons. It was because I used to do a lot of really bad HDR editing of these like super ridiculous mountain scenes. And people would say that, like, I knew that was yours before I saw the name. And now I look back at that and I'm like, oh my God, what a terrible thing to be known for. Like, I just don't want that to it just doesn't represent who I am anymore. So that's been a painful thing for me, is like, not painful, but just kind of rediscovering who I am as a photographer. It's actually exciting, not painful. But I look forward to the time when people say that again.
Yeah. Well, so in a different way. Yeah, it's all about, could be about style or the way you see or your vision, your personal vision.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you brought it up. One of the things that I feel like we all can do from time to time is compare our work to other people. And I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit more about that and kind of how you think about that.
I was going to also ask you that too, but I'm never concerned about approval from others. I think I mentioned that a little bit. And I know there's huge danger, great danger in chasing popularity. And that's the whole thing on social media, which, that could be a whole discussion. But I think we lose our originality when we try to meet approval. I think I explained that also about the way high school, kind of thing. So, there's lots of analogies there, but I think there's a negative aspect of that, comparing your work to others. And I think some suggestions to break away from that is like to relax control and loosen up and give permission for us to do new things as photographers, try new ideas, and, take more risks in our image making. And it's easier said than done, but once you do it, it's like, wow, it's like this super load comes off. It's like a freedom to do. Just imagine if you didn't care. I mean, it's not like you don't care. I don't mean it in a negative way. But if you weren't concerned about what other people thought, then you really can find your own voice. Because otherwise, you're kind of really wearing someone else's clothes, so to speak. you know.
Yeah, and
it's easier said than done,
too,
but it's
right?
also tough. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard when. So two things come to mind for me. It's hard when photographers rely on workshops or print sales to sustain them financially, because for at least some people I've spoken to, those two things are kind of always in the back of their mind in terms of like, oh, I got to get a good photo of this area to use for promotion of my workshops. And I think that's the problem with that approach is, is your workshop about a location or is it about you as the photographer, right? So I think that's one thing there. And then the other is print sales. Like, if you do make a lot of money on print sales, there's certain images that just don't do well, or maybe there's certain types of images that consistently sell well for you. And it's like you feel compelled to create more similar images so that you can continue to financially sustain yourself. So those are challenges that I see some photographers facing. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean you have to appease those needs, but I think for some people that's always going to be in the back of their heads.
True. Yeah, very true. I think in terms of workshops, I think that I've slowly gained a reputation for the way I see and the way I help people see on their own terms. No, I never, impose my seeing on my participants or students, but I ask them questions when I look at what they make photograph, and I will ask them a question. Instead of saying you should do it this way, I will ask them, what about this or this, so they can figure it out on their own. But so everything is a little different there. So for me, it's reputation and my personal vision based on, examples. But I'm not really in the print sales side of it. I mean, I used to have gallery representation, but I kind of got really busy with workshops and tours, and I was at the top of my game just before the pandemic, and it's all deflated and slowly crawling back.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, something that's related to this that I really wanted to talk to you about is kind of getting into creative ruts in terms of how our images look and feel. I know, most of us can kind of get into a rut where our photographs start to all kind of look the same. And sometimes I think this is because we're in a creative rut, but I also think there might be a voice in the back of our head saying, we need this to be consistent to our brand and our style. How do you balance that when you're making images? Sounds like
That's
you don't even
question.
think about that.
I'm not even aware that I have a brand. I guess I have a style. But I think that in terms of that's addressing that part. Do I have a brand? I'm not worried about a brand. I think that as a photographer, I'm lousy at marketing, but as a photographer, if I have a brand, my brand is my vision, right? Which is exemplified by the photographs that one looks at. But on the other side of being in a rut or a creative rut, I deal with that by working in different genres, which I kind of addressed. Well, I did address out of Chicago on my Saturday morning talk about crossing over boundaries. And that, let's face it, 40 some years, you could have a tendency to get a little bit stale, depending on what you're up to. But so those crossing over boundaries in different genres has really kept me at the top of my game and excited all the time. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, when I had 7 full trips sold out and canceled, and suddenly it's like in the days of school where the bus doesn't come because of a storm and you get a day off. Only this was 2 years off. So things happen, right? So I started going out and just photographing where I live, which I never had time to before because I was always getting ready for the next trip. And then I started mixing it up with auto salvage yards, or you can call them junk yards. Those are all labels.
Interesting.
And I think I showed some of that stuff. And so I was maintaining my excitement by, making field trips to photograph. And I wasn't photographing the label, automobiles that are rusting away in a forest. I was photographing sculpture and landscapes of the mind. And it was exciting. And then I would go out to a provincial park and I would take the same trail over and over again and photograph it in different seasons or different lighting conditions and different climates. So I kept really up there. So just those mixtures of interest kept me fresh. And and also I get inspired also by movies and just all visual things really pump me up. So I'm kind of always hyped up and ready to do something and excited. So I think that's a good way to be.
How did you
I don't know if that answers.
It does, yeah. How did you get into the salvage yards? Like that's a great idea.
Okay, well, it goes way back to when I was working in the architectural practice. I was teaching night classes in photography, and I did a night class in design, in composition, without rules. I'm against rules. So I had like a mixture of painters and photographers, and we were just dissecting and discussing images and how they work and how they express certain feelings. And then I found this really interesting rusted truck in a field, and I photographed it. And it was part of my presentation discussion. And the guy in the class said, if you like this, you should go to this place because they have 600 of these old rusting things, trucks and cars, like 1950s and 40s. So that was kind of the side road that I took from all up to that point. It was all natural world. And I took this little side road, and it kind of dovetailed with my fascination with sculpture and painting and that lifelong interest in that. So that's interesting how serendipity takes you on different things. And, I also enjoy photographing really graphic modern architecture. So like in the city of Toronto, I live 3 hours east of Toronto, and I enjoy photographing it there. And I've done some workshops there as well. And just seeing abstraction. Again, it's not an architectural workshop. It's about seeing patterns and curvilinear form and so on in the architecture. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm all over the place there. But I think that kind of shows you the dovetailing of interests that keep me out of a rut. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like
do you find you're in a rut sometimes?
Oh, of course.
Well, we all do.
It's almost
human, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like like when you're working out and you're working different muscles. I feel like creativity is a lot of different muscles, and sometimes as nature photographers, we're only flexing one of those muscles, and the rest of the muscles are kind of atrophying. So it sounds like your approach is being to like work all the muscles out, so that the main muscle can still stay strong, but it's not relying on just that one thing.
Yeah. So that's a good way to put it. Yeah. I think that my reason for different genres is not for financial, because I want to profit from, let's say I want to do all these different things to make more income. I'm doing it purely for creative purposes. So I'm kind of funneled into, I've always been teaching. So, I mean, a lot of times workshop instructors are, very successful stock photographers and so on from the day, and then sort of had to find another way. But right from the very beginning of my career, I was helping, even if informally, I was teaching and helping people. And I just autopilot to that. I even help people that aren't even in my workshop. If I'm seeing somebody struggling on the street, or I'll show them this really cool shot I just made, and they're just a stranger, and they say, "Oh, that's cool. I love that. How do you see that?" So I think I'm always in that mode. So that's my motive for that. So it's, but it is a good. I mean, it's not for everybody, I suppose, but I think it might be something to think about if you're a photographer and you try some different things. Just try different things.
Can you talk to me about the importance of restoring our amateur status?
Okay, so I think being an expert at anything inhibits creativity. I mean, it sounds like a weird comment, but when I find that once you become the expert, you because you're told or you think you're the expert, you stop exploring beyond that. So, if I thought I knew everything, then that's the moment I would stop growing and I always want to keep growing in my work. So I think in order to look at the world with fresh eyes, we need to empty out old habits of thinking. And it kind of reminds me, another analogy is like when I was in school, and I don't know if you had blackboards when you were in school. Maybe they have electronic boards now, but back in the day we had slate blackboards with chalk, and every day someone was assigned to clean those boards spotless for the next day. So the analogy there is, I think we should clean our blackboards or defrag our minds of all that accumulative stuff so that we can be fresh with new ideas. Might be hard, easier said than done. I think we should always be striving to learn more and grow and more in our photography, and not accept the fact that let's say, for example, I've done multiple exposures for 30 some years. If I thought I was the expert, then I would stop experimenting. And when I switched to a mirrorless camera, it threw off the procedure for making them for me. It was not like all the previous times I did it. I had to do it very differently, so I had to kind of relearn it. And at first it was, and some of my friends were saying it's a negative thing, but I kept pushing through, and I found out actually the way it is now, it's actually an advantage over the way I used to do it. But so I think, always pushing for that. Do you find that you have that issue, or, can you relate to that?
Yeah, I think the way that I can relate to that is I find myself using the same kind of techniques over and over again and not trying new ones. And obviously, like, the more you can experiment, the better. I wouldn't say better images, but it definitely expands your horizons.
Yeah.
So last fall for me was like really pivotal because I actually experimented with a lot of different techniques that I was familiar with, but that I didn't really use very often. And it was actually a lot of fun because it opened up a lot of doors for me in terms of just making images that are very different than what I normally make. And it was a lot more fun.
Yeah, that's good. That sometimes things trigger you to pivot at a different point, right? And sometimes it's through practical reasons but I think that's really important to, just to always sort of let go of old knowledge.
Yeah, just let it go. I like it.
Maybe the new stuff will help trigger new ways of approaching things. Like, do you find that, for example, we always are creatures of habit, right? And I see people like walk up and set their tripod up before they even see what they're going to do. They just set it up at a normal height, right? And what if you want to be low? They're committing already before they even look around. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying it's just a habit, right? So do you find sometimes you take a certain height to explore things, or do you experiment like low to the ground? How often do you make a picture right on the ground with your camera, right at the ground, or right at the surface of the water? Yeah.
No, I've the last year I've been intentionally keeping the tripod away at first and exploring different angles of the camera, just because I did find myself getting into more of a kind of business as usual approach to using the tripod. And that definitely helped me in terms of, getting lower, getting higher, shooting at different angles. And so I think it's important, in my approach now, it's important the tripod is like later, and I try to find the interesting image first.
Yeah. I remember when I started in photography, I had all the Ansel Adams books, and you talked about using the preview card to visualize a viewfinder, right?
Oh, right.
And just to walk around and explore possibilities, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes we would do this with, I'm talking about the film days, transparencies, and sometimes you could just use an empty slide frame, and use that. But it's nice to have a bigger card. It's about visualizing. So before you commit, you spend some time and you look around, and we'll hopefully talking about the art of slowness as well. But it's like it helps you, not just be in default mode and just stand up and do the same thing, because that's how you can get out of that mode, is by just breaking it up. And sometimes I even know about this, and I sometimes forget to explore different points of view. And I absolutely love the flip screen. And years ago when I went to India, I picked up a Canon point and shoot. It had a flip screen. I'm a Nikon user, but so I always said way back then, in a perfect world, every camera would have a flip screen. But, many, many years after, all my Nikons didn't have that. But I went to mirrorless, it had a flip screen. I didn't ask for it, but it had it. And I find it really useful to work at low levels without getting your face in, where you can't get your face down someplace and you would want to look through the viewfinder. But it's such a nice convenience to do that. And you can get...
Yeah, Sony finally has it on the A7R5. Not to talk about gear, but I've been waiting for that forever. I finally have it.
Well, it's just a nice part of the tool, right? It's just, these are all tools, and we just work. You can hand me anything and I'll work with it. But if you have these options, they're just kind of nice to.
Yeah.
Because I often would work at ground level, and it's not easy when it's like muddy and wet.
Right.
It's not fun. And some places you just don't want to, but I think it's exciting. And I guess it's all coming back to the point of view, the unusual vantage point about looking at something, because we tend to just look, in general, we tend to look at our height, eye level height. And I always joke about I can't get high enough or low enough. And so it's always fun. But
yeah, I'm actually excited. This year I got a new tripod that goes higher than I've ever had before, and so I'm not totally sure how I'll use that, but it gives you one other option that you didn't have at your disposal before in terms of experimentation. So
yeah, and because you're extremely high, you can use the screen to modify.
Right. Actually,
your height.
Now that I mentioned that, I did actually use that in the last outing. I was photographing an agave plant on the ground, but I don't have a macro lens right now, but I do have a 100 to 400, but I wanted to get far enough away from it so that I could actually get it properly in focus and everything. And having the high tripod with the flip screen was perfect.
That's great. So it's good to have the tools.
Good to have the tools.
Just sort of adapt to what you have.
Yeah,
yeah, right.
Well, can you tell me about your approach to questioning everything? Like, what do you mean by that?
Sounds kind of pompous, doesn't it? But actually, when I was younger,
sounds like a sci-fi movie or something.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. I think it comes from political and to all kinds of things in life. I think we should always question things and not take it for face value. But for me, in creativity, it means I'm talking about looking at things in different ways, in adopting a different approach. And there was this quote that I don't know who it's from one of the books I have, but it says, "If it's not broke, break it." That's like the opposite. I love that. You should get a T-shirt with that. So basically, take things apart, so to speak, and shake up everything.
Yeah.
In terms of, and you never know where it's going to lead to. It may not lead to anything, but it possibly may lead to something.
I love it.
These are just, all these things they all add to the, the craft, and just keep growing, right? I don't think we want to do the same thing forever. So
no.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps related to that question, I wanted to ask you if you could tell me about the role of ambiguity in your creative process. Okay.
Well, I think that we were taught in school not to be ambiguous, right? In writing class and so on. But I think there's something nice about looking at images that we don't quite know what's there. what we're looking at. And as photographers, we kind of want to know what that is. It's natural. But I think that all ties into labels and labeling things. So if you connect that back to the junkyards, which actually the word junk is a negative word, negative label, but salvage yards. But if those images I have of the old cars and trucks, they're really, to me, they're not about the label cars and trucks. They're about, and actually for me, it's the landscapes of the mind. I'm looking at landscapes. I'm looking at sand dunes where the undulating curves and the colors, and a lot of colors that are like in nature, that are rusted, and patinas are very much like the earth. And so I think when we engage in something that's new, we should engage with our imagination instead of using labels to try and figure out what it is, or even ask what it is. Like, you can look at a stream with interesting flecks on it, and it could look like galaxies in the night sky. But it's nice to have that playful way of looking at things, even though it's just water with flecks on it. But the way it's presented, and it's absolute reality through your camera, it can be quite different. So it's somewhat ambiguous. I think I really enjoy images that are ambiguous. And I don't know about you. Would you see, when you see something that you don't know what it is, are you tempted? I mean, as a photographer, you might be tempted to wonder about what it is. But don't you think that you would enjoy it so much, and if you didn't know what it quite what it was identifying as?
I absolutely love trying to figure out what stuff is when when it's not obvious. I think that's incredibly fun, and I think it also is shows the true genius of the photographer, that they were able to recognize that there's ambiguity in the subject that they're photographing, and that the viewer would have fun playing around with that in their mind. I'm curious for you, when you're capturing ambiguity, when you're capturing ambiguity, is it intentional or is it accidental?
It's subconscious.
Okay.
I don't think, I'm so much on autopilot that I don't really have any intentions. I mean, I totally am just, I am completely, and I'm completely open to, and no agenda, right? So I have never any sort of intent. And actually, that's my secret sauce, one of my secret sauces.
Well, you heard it here. There's a secret sauce.
Not overthinking it, right? So when you overthink, the more you hash it out, the duller it might be. That's for me anyway. That's my experience.
Well, it totally makes sense. Yeah, totally. Well, I know you had started to allude to this a little bit, and I know it's become a bit of a cliche, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the importance of slowing down in your approach to making photographs.
Yeah. Did you say that was somewhat cliche these days?
I mean, it's...
Or you hear a lot about it, you mean?
A lot of people are talking about it, yeah.
Yeah. I think I learned about it back in the early 80s from Robert Stahl. He's an amazing, very creative photographer out in Seattle. And he was talking about the art of slowness. But I think, let's face it, you can't rush creativity. And on my workshops that I've been doing for so many years, I see the effects of, I call it hurry sickness on the workshop participants. And I kind of also call it the butterfly effect. So, I mean, I move pretty slowly on a trail or on a path that I'm photographing, or a direction I'm photographing. And I see people, I could spend like an hour in one spot and people will come up, take a shot, they're gone over there, they're over there, but never spending enough time to get into the essence of what they're looking at. You can't really see because seeing takes time, right? So, and a hurried life can exhaust the creative mind. I mean, we're all sometimes overbooked and all that kind of thing, but so it's really mindfulness. That's a word that's used a lot, but it's being mindful and almost meditative in your photography. I think the first time I heard meditation described to me, I immediately thought, that's what I do with my photography. I didn't even know I was doing it. So it was being slow, mindful, taking everything in, and as opposed to rushing it. So I think, practicing slowness in your photography is very beneficial. Sometimes it just could be like, if you're out, you do a lot of hiking stuff and long trips, right?
Yep.
They don't have to be long trips, but let's say you're out for 3 or 4 hours. It's useful every hour or two just to stop and just relax for 20 minutes and just take it in, and then pick up your camera, and it helps you slow down. So
yeah. As you were talking about this, as you were talking about this, I had a little bit of a realization. So back in, it's probably starting in 2018, I would do these annual photography trips for long periods of times in the fall. And most years I would meet up with a photographer that I really admire. His name is Jimmy Gekas, and he has a lot of really expressive, just intimate, amazing photographs, especially in fall. And I never could figure out, I figured out now, but at the time I was like, how is he pulling this off? Like, he's just a genius. And I remember, as you were talking, I was thinking about the first time I went hiking with him. And we were on this trail. It's probably like 2 miles long to this beaver pond. And I remember I had gone all the way to the end of the trail and back and made like maybe 3 photos. And he was still standing in the same place and making photos. And I was like, oh, what are you photographing, And it just dawns on me that, and I take the similar approach now too. Now I'm much, much slower in my approach and much more just open, and I'm not in a hurry to get anywhere. But it's just dawned on me that like that's Jimmy's secret sauce too. He doesn't have the, what did you call it? The hurry sickness. He doesn't have that.
Yeah, hurry sickness.
He probably was watching me. And he's like, wow, that guy has hurry sickness.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's actually a good exercise is to, if people who can slow down, aside from, putting a chain on their leg and tie them to the tree, is to actually say, okay, stop, take 10 paces and stop. I know Freeman Patterson does this on his workshops. And just stay there and shoot 30 pictures. And don't leave that spot until you make 30 pictures. They may not be so-called award-winning pictures, but they will help you have little breakthroughs. Or it just takes time to find things. I guess you could think about, I don't know if I could relate this to nature, but if you drive around your neighborhood in a town or a city you live in, versus walking the same route, you will see so many different things because you're slowing down, you're taking in stuff you didn't even know. It's interesting how that works, and I can't equate that to nature so much, but no, I'm sure that, and
that's a perfect
hopefully
analogy.
People don't take a motorcycle through the trails.
No, that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
I was thinking back to when I lived in Portland, Oregon. It's very walkable there, and where I moved from, Colorado Springs, is not walkable at all. And it was the first time in my life that I found myself spending a lot of time walking between my house and other places. Because in Colorado Springs, I lived, way out, in the suburb, middle of nowhere. And if you wanted to go anywhere, you had to drive. And living in Portland really opened my eyes to kind of what you're talking about. I remember I would start to notice all kinds of things in the city, like, oh, look how they have this decorated on their fence. Like, just really mundane things that would start to catch my attention. And I think what you're saying is very useful if people can take that analogy to heart. I think it works very well.
Yeah, I've experienced, going to the parking lot of a trailhead for conservation area or provincial park. And, 2 hours later, I haven't made it much past the parking lot because there was such amazing tree formations. And, so that's just, there's so many examples, but I guess it all comes back to that just taking your time. And seeing does take time. I think it's so natural. We live in such hurried environments. everything is like fast food, Amazon one day delivery. We're just so pumped up for everything right away. So I think it's almost like the opposite. The opposite to that is good. So I hope that kind of addresses that whole concept of slowness, and I hope it doesn't become a cliche as much as.
No,
I do.
Another thing I was going to add into that is what I see a lot of photographers doing, including myself, a lot of trips is, like let's say you've got a trip planned to Utah, and you create this list of all these locations that you want to go to, right? You're like, oh, I want to go see this. I want to go see that. I want to go to this place. And to me, like that approach to making images also puts you in that kind of mental mode of being rushed, and you're going to miss out on a lot of things that I think it's much more advantageous if you want to create work that's a little bit more meaningful, a little bit more unique. Maybe just pick 2 of those 5 places and spend more time at them. Put in the time.
It puts a lot of pressure on you. There's a lot of pressure on you. When you're under pressure, I don't know if you could be as creative as, to get these different locations, right? I don't know, for me, I would crumble under the pressure of that. Maybe, I've done commercial assignments for architects, and they've always been really successful. But I got to tell you, it's a lot of pressure because you got to produce this stuff. It always works out, but it's not something I'd want to be doing all the time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Pressure on you.
Well, cool, Richard. So a couple more questions for you. What are some things that you have coming up that you'd like our audience to know a little bit more about?
Okay, well, I had to jot that down a bit, and the next sort of major thing I have coming up is Japan, a workshop in Japan in May. I'm doing a full program, plus I'm doing an extension for the architecture in Tokyo, the modern architecture.
Oh, wow.
Then I'm going back to Newfoundland in August, which is something I love going to every year. It restores me. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place to see. And I got another trip to Colombia in the end of next year, and all those tours and workshops are on my website. And I have a critique group with Eric Bennett, April 22nd, but this may not air before. It may air after that. But I also have out of Chicago a street workshop with out of Chicago in the city in June.
Okay, awesome.
And that's going to be exciting. That's my first time. I've been 3 years with out of Chicago live, and this will be my first time in person. I get to meet Chris and all the other people, so that's nice.
Yeah, he's a good dude. He's a goofball.
Yeah, I think they run a really great. I'm very impressed. Well, you've been 2 or 3 years with them.
Yeah, I've done I've done 2 lives and 2 in persons.
Okay, so I did a panel with you on conservation photography with Eric Bennett, and was that the second year?
Yeah, that was
I did 3 years.
Technically, yeah, that year I wasn't officially part of it.
Okay,
Chicago Live.
So that was my first year. So it was technically not your first year, but
that was like the in between year that I wasn't invited.
Yeah,
Eric just snuck me in.
It was a lot of fun. Yeah, that's pretty cool. In the side door, right? You had a backstage pass.
Yeah, he's like, I'm
really impressed with out of Chicago and what they put on, and I think it's a fantastic weekend. It's a lot to see and a lot to view. Yeah,
I hope they do it again in 2024.
Yeah, it's up in the air. I don't know if they're going to do as a Zoom, but I think it may happen that way.
So, last question: who would you recommend for the podcast?
Well, there's so many photographers that come to mind, and but as I made a list, I realized that a lot of them have already been on your podcast. And how many episodes have you? You're over 300.
Yeah, when this one comes out, it'll be 316.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
So my list I had on my list some Canadian photographers, to start off with, and the first one was Stephen Patterson. I mentioned him before in presentations, and I think his work has a very sophisticated eye, and it's really hard to explain photography, but it's really inspiring. I have worked with him over the years in conferences, and I've done workshops with him, and he just blows me away with the way he sees. His vision is very unique and very fresh. So that is one. And the other photographer, and he's Stephen Patterson's in Halifax. The other photographer is Andre Gallant. He's a teaching partner with Freeman Patterson. And by the way, Stephen Patterson is not related to Freeman Patterson. So Andre Gallant is the second one. And the third one is and also Andre is in New Brunswick, was Eastern Canada. Mike Grand Mason is another photographer in Winnipeg, Canada, Manitoba. And he's a landscape photographer, and he has a great body of work. He has several books, and I think he'd be an interesting one to look up. The last Canadian on that list was Maurice Henry, and he's out of Moncton. And he does cameras for healing and projects, and he's very involved in photography and workshops and so on. And then I had on the other part of the list was Tony Sweet, which I just reconnected with Tony Sweet on the last out of Chicago, and so we had a Zoom meeting after that and just caught up a little bit. But yeah, so that's my list of photographers. I'm sure you get lots of suggestions.
No, but I depend on these suggestions for future episodes, so I really appreciate it.
I remember you had a long list of charts of all these different names that you're juggling and trying to get coordinated and so on.
Yeah, it must
be
fun.
Quite a task. Yeah, I bet it is. And you get to talk to a lot of different personalities.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Richard, this has been awesome, and I think what we'll do is we'll save potentially one of my favorite topics for our Patreon bonus episode, which is perfectionism. But for now, we'll go ahead and sign off, and thank you so much. I had such a great time.
Yeah, and thank you too. I so enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that some of my answers made sense. It was wonderful to be on here.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you, Richard, for joining us on the podcast. You are a huge inspiration to so many photographers, and I loved how you explained your approach to making photos. It gave me a lot to think about, and I know our listeners will also be thinking about how this affects them for quite some time. Thank you so much, my friend. Well, that's all I've got for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.